Welcome to another episode of Clear Light Connections, where we talk to the people behind the businesses of Bay Area Houston, proudly sponsored by UTMB Health. Special guest today is Dr. Gregory Gray from UTMB, and you're here to talk about the One Health initiative.
Well, yes, thanks. I've just joined UTMB about 2 months ago from Duke University, and I'm a proponent of this One Health approach to solving wicked problems.
Yeah, and please describe what the One Health initiative is and basically its impact on medicine.
Well, today, with the modern movement of people, goods, and animals, we have very complex problems, such as those we're facing now with COVID-19. And these problems can't be solved by any one discipline or any one institution. It's complicated and has many factors. And so the solution to approaching these wicked problems is approaching it from the One Health way. And basically that means bringing in the various disciplines that need to be engaged to approach the problem and solve it.
When did this movement first start?
Well, the concept's pretty old, actually. It has to do with our interlinkage with animals and the environment, how, you just can't really separate the three, human health, animal health, environmental health. But we've developed sort of a parochial approach to training. And so while I was trained in medicine, I didn't really understand anything about what the veterinarians do. In a similar fashion, not so much about what environmental health professionals do. So we're having to reconnect with people from different disciplines when we look at these complicated problems.
And so were you brought in specifically to bring this initiative to UTMB?
Well, I think one of the things that UTMB brought me in for is to bring the One Health approach more in the limelight of what UTMB is doing. Actually, UTMB is already doing a lot of One Health right now. It's just that they haven't really branded it in a way that honors all their investments. But UTMB is heavily engaged in looking for zoonoses, or diseases that move back and forth between humans and animals, and looking at environmental factors such as populations of insects that carry those diseases. So we're going to try to basically bring together the faculty, the staff scientists together, and increase our training and better promote what is going on and build on that. The other thing I do is I'm an infectious disease epidemiologist, and I study respiratory viruses like the coronaviruses that we're so concerned about today. Also the influenza viruses and some other viruses, killer cold viruses we call adenoviruses, enteroviruses, and some paramyxoviruses. So my group looks at 5 different families of respiratory viruses.
And you did mention that while that was your training, there was all these other components of the One Health initiative, or the idea of One Health that you knew nothing about. What have you learned that's really kind of brought it all together for you?
Well, in pursuing these complex problems, like, for instance, the risk that a influenza A virus from birds, avian flu, might hurt us in a big way, cause a pandemic. I've learned a lot from my veterinary colleagues. I mean, I've spent a lot of time both in the United States and internationally studying animal husbandry in a similar fashion with respect to swine influenza and the coronaviruses that live in animals. How do veterinarians care for their herds and flocks? And there's a lot to learn there. Veterinarians are great to work with. They have a population-based philosophy where those of us in human medicine are sort of trained to take care of one patient at a time. So that's been unique. And then in the last 10 years or so, we've also benefited from environmental health scientists. And it turns out that they have a lot of devices that those of us in human medicine are not experienced with. For instance, their devices can pull viral nucleic acid and sometimes live viruses from the air. And as we know, COVID-19 is heavily transmitted through the air. Those devices have come into the forefront of scientific new knowledge because people have been putting the devices in healthcare settings and home settings and the public square settings and making remarkable discoveries that have influenced, how we respond.
Yeah, and we always love to talk about UTMB is such a great teaching hospital. So how does this work its way into the study?
UTMB is extraordinarily rich in training environments and in institutional support, and I'm just beginning to learn about that institutional support. But they already have some One Health training programs that they've used to train not only scholars in Texas, but also international scholars. And the idea is to equip international and Texas scholars to be able to respond more efficiently and quickly to whatever threat we encounter next. And sometimes that has involved partnering with Texas A&M and doing simulation, disaster events, not only infectious disease, but other types of disasters, and just helping the young scholars understand, how to tap into the skills that scholars that have trained outside of their sphere, what they can offer in problem solving.
Yeah, and you kind of mentioned avian flu, swine flu, and it kind of reminded me that I think we've forgotten how connected we are with the animal world and the environment. One of your colleagues was on and was talking about how this area has a higher concentration, it seems, of breast cancer patients, and they believe it's environmental. So I there's factors like that, and then I'm reminded of in the 80s there was mad cow disease in Britain. And I spent enough time over there to where now I can't give blood over here. And it reminds me of that interconnectedness that you're talking about the different disciplines.
Well, it's really true, and it's a two-way street. And that's one of the remarkable things that we've learned about. While we do our best to provide biosecurity, for instance, with meat processing centers, the people in those centers suffered greatly from COVID-19 because sometimes there was an accelerated transmission in the crowded facilities. In a similar fashion, sometimes, for instance, animal workers have introduced human pathogens into animals. And so working at this human-animal nexus is a critical area. And so we recommend that if we're looking for the next generation of threats, we need to be looking where there's dense populations of humans and in close contact with dense populations of animals. And it's a little bit complicated, but one can see it as perhaps an example of when you first have a young child and you send that young child to daycare. The hygienic situation is such that child's going to bring home whatever viruses are circulating in daycare. Everybody gets a cold. Well, in a animal health or in an animal production facility, whatever viruses are circulating in the animals are amplified because their animals are so many, and the hygiene is not so good separating the animals. And so, it makes sense to us that if you're looking for the next coronavirus threat, you have some understanding of what coronaviruses are in those dense populations of animals, and it's beginning to spill over. And we don't think this occurs like overnight. In fact, there's evolutionary virology data to suggest that the COVID-19 virus, SARS-CoV-2, it probably took it 30 or 40 years to adapt. At least about a year ago, the nearest the nearest neighbor genetically, it departed sometime after 1969. Now, they found some closer relatives to this virus now. But at any rate, if we could do the surveillance for novel viruses before the virus fully adapt to humans and becomes highly transmissible and then virulent, then we could develop diagnostics and vaccines to stay ahead of the game. Right now, we're kind of we're responding to whatever raises its head. So we're becoming advocates. Let's do periodic surveillance in hotspots for emerging infectious diseases to better anticipate the threats.
So a very proactive approach.
Yes, and we think we can do it in a way that it's not so expensive and it's not so complex, and it's compatible and attractive to some of our partners in the developing world, where there might be some resistance to doing this. If we came in like we used to do international surveillance, not really offering anything to help the people of the developing countries, just going in, getting their specimens and bringing them to the developed world. So the philosophy has changed somewhat to partnering with them in the last 20 years or so, more so than just going in and doing the studying and pulling the specimens out.
And you've been a part of this initiative in several places around the globe, correct?
Yeah, before COVID, at Duke, we were in 14 countries doing various different surveillance and training programs, training them how to do One Health. So right now, we have active studies chiefly in Eastern Malaysia and Vietnam. We also have a smattering of other studies in Kenya, Sri Lanka, China, and Pakistan and the Philippines, smaller studies. But we basically have engaged our partners in those countries to do One Health types of studies at the human-animal interface, or where you can't do that, if there's a political barrier or whatever, looking at people who are hospitalized with pneumonia. Or we recently found the first ever alpha coronavirus. So there's 5 or 6 different types of coronavirus. This was the first alpha, a canine-like, a dog-like corona that was isolated from patients in eastern Malaysia, a state called Sarawak. It's on the island of Borneo. It's on the equator, very different equatorial wildlife and everything. It was from a patient with pneumonia. And so that virus represents a whole nother group of viruses that could cause threats to humans. And then shortly after that, another group used our approach, and they found this very 99.4% similar virus in Haiti, 1,000 miles away. So the take-home message is that we're probably assaulted all the time with novel viruses, but because our healthcare setting diagnostics will not pick them up, our diagnostics are dialed in to only pick up known viruses and not to cross-react with others. Because they're so dialed in, we don't, unless there's an outbreak, we don't invest the diagnostic to discover a new virus. So what we're saying is you need to develop a newer approach that looks with what we call our pan-species diagnostics, picks up all the coronaviruses, and periodic surveillance in certain areas, so we can pick these things up maybe 20, 30 years before they become a problem.
Yeah, it sounds like it would go a long way in hopefully preventing the type of things we've experienced over the last 18 months.
Well, we think so. And I'm not alone. There are other people who have embraced this kind of approach. In fact, many arms of the U.S. government and the EU and a number of other governments have embraced the One Health approach. The WHO, the equivalent in the animal world, the OIE, have said, this One Health approach is the way to problem solve for infectious diseases, but also for different things like antimicrobial resistant organisms, or things that involve complex health toxicology, air pollution. You need to get human, animal, and sometimes environmental health scientists working together.
So, me as a patient, what does it look like to me if it's done right? If it's
well, as an individual patient, it doesn't really impact you at all unless you're perhaps an animal worker. And so we would think that the animal workers, the people that work with, 20,000 head of cattle or hogs or, big flocks of egg-laying chickens, because there's a large animal population, once a virus gets in there, it never burns out because there's a constant introduction of immunologically naive animals. And so the virus is sustained. It's like a giant daycare center with new kids coming in all the time. It just goes from one generation of kids to the next. Well, if that virus is not killing the animals, there's no incentive for the animal production facility to do anything about it. They just, it's a nuisance. But if that virus spills over to the animal workers and causes them problems, and then we got, potential for them to seed their communities and the cities and cause the problem. So what we have to do is focus surveillance at the human-animal interface, looking both at the animals and the people and determining what viruses are in the people that shouldn't be there. So, for instance, we just did a study with some folks at Colorado State. They were actually looking for toxic irritants for the lung in dairy farms. And they had these little samplers that people wore around all day, and they did nasal swabs. Bottom line is they found all sorts of evidence of an influenza D virus that is highly enzootic or endemic, we say, in the cattle that they're exposed to. And yet this virus doesn't yet, or as we know, cause illness. It infects people, but it doesn't cause them to be real sick. But if that virus were to mutate and cause serious illness, there's almost no way those dairy workers could escape it. So that's the kind of information we need to understand, what viruses are circulating in these big herds and flocks for meat production. I mean, we got to have these herds and flocks. It's the most efficient way to produce meat. I'm not saying but we have to partner with the industry, to anticipate the threats. Now, because the threats can move also from humans to animals, it makes sense to study the animals as well for the movement of human pathogens.
Because that represents another mutation of some sort.
Yeah, the human pathogens actually have caused in pig farming, influenza A, have spilled over, a term, cross-species, and caused cross-species infections in the pigs, and sometimes that's problematic. And sometimes people can introduce various pathogens that harm pigs inadvertently, for instance, in their shoes or whatever. So there's a big movement now to make our meat production farms, pig agriculture, more biosecure, through showering and changing clothes and all that stuff, and cleaning vehicles and et cetera. But sometimes we forget that the human can carry it in their nasal or their lung in the respiratory system. And for that reason, we need to find low-cost ways to do surveillance so as not to harm the businesses.
Yeah, this sounds like a great approach and a proactive one that hopefully, takes hold and really helps prevent, kind of like you said. I mean, no matter which way it goes, but helps detect these things before they become big, big problems.
Yeah. So I had a young scholar, a postdoc, with me at Duke, and we won a small grant or permission to do a study in partnership with pig farms in North Carolina. And we set up these aerosol samplers and periodically check them for known pig viruses. And the aerosol samplers can pick up the air that 100 pigs breathe, and you don't have to touch the animals. So it's an attractive way to do surveillance. You don't have to grab a pig and shove a swab down them and make the pig anxious. At any rate, we found an incursion, a new introduction of a virus 1 week before it caused disease enough for them to call the veterinarians in. And so these techniques, this One Health, was an environmental sampler, One Health approaches can really help the industry as well.
Yeah. And it sounds like it's going to help protect us all down the road. So very encouraging.
And it's catching on. I mean, there are in many economic forums and in legislation and policy documents, not just the U.S., but many developed countries, there are embracements in that language of the One Health approach.
Well, I want to thank you for coming on the show today, and appreciate you being in this area. And it sounds like good things are going to happen at UTMB.
Well, thanks, Jameson.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Hello, Clear Lake Area Chamber of Commerce members and Bay Area Houston. If you're a business wanting to expand your customer base, give back to your community, think about the quality of life around Clear Lake area, think about joining the chamber. Go to clearlakearea.com for more information.